Okay, so I propose that we start. For those who joined us, you have the survey to complete as well. So thank you so much. I'll get back to it in a little bit, maybe by asking my colleague Matvey if he can show us the results. So this was just a small icebreaker to feel the temperature in the room with regards to how you position yourself, what are your attitudes or perceptions of dilemmas, of compromise in humanitarian negotiations. So I'll ask Matvey if you can show us the results to the first questions, please. So the first question I asked you was, in your opinion, which happens more often in humanitarian negotiations? Option 1 was making concessions and compromises. It depends, or adhering strictly to the humanitarian principles. And so far, the ranking is number 1 is making compromises and concessions as well. So this is good, right? Because the session is all about that. Great. Let's move maybe to the next question, if you please, Matvey. Which red lines do you believe should never be crossed in humanitarian negotiations? And here we had multiple choice questions, and the answers are coming. And the number 1, accepting conditions that can harm beneficiaries. That's really interesting. Then maybe number 2 is putting staff safety at risk. Interesting. Okay, let's see the third one and the last one. Which factors would compel you to consider crossing the red lines you have set for your negotiations? And I see here maybe the ones which are popping up is safety, security. I think Felicie, you will be happy about that. Life-saving, the humanitarian imperative, very interesting, and desperation. Great. As answers are coming up, maybe I'll launch the session, and maybe we can move to the next deck, please, Matvey. So welcome, everybody. I hope that you are enjoying this first day from the CCHN Summit on Humanitarian Negotiation. And I hope that all the discussions and the sessions you attended were insightful and were rich. This afternoon, we are diving into a very critical subject. I pitched it this morning for those who are here, and we titled it The Crossroads of Conscience, or how humanitarian negotiators need to master a delicate dance between the principles, or the humanitarian principles, and the need to be pragmatic in the field. So I think with this morning's sessions, and for those who were with us, our community members, in the past 2 days, we know that today many things are shifting in the context in which we are working, right? So we have, on one hand, the dynamics of conflict and crisis are evolving. We are working in more complex environments. Our humanitarian space is also shrinking. We have ever-growing humanitarian needs, which are also outpacing the resources which are at our disposal to meet the needs of the people who are affected by these crises. So how does that impact humanitarian negotiators? At the CCHN, we have a community of practice, of more than 7,400 frontline negotiators. And what do they tell us? They tell us that on a daily basis, every day, they have to navigate in a sea of bad choices. There's no right or wrong choice. Every choice that you make will have consequences. Every choice that you make will impact something else, will be in tension with something else. So in the sea of bad choices, their struggle, as they tell us, whether they are in Burkina Faso, whether they are in Haiti, whether they are in Colombia, whether they are in Palestine, whether they are in Ukraine, whether they are anywhere in the world, the struggle is, how can I get to make the least bad choice? And this is a decision-making process that is fraught or filled with moral and ethical dilemmas, which sometimes keep us awake at night or which make us feel ever so lonely in this world. So some of these dilemmas, we mentioned them this morning. How can I be principled, like to maintain and uphold the core humanitarian principles, whilst at the same time navigating operational field realities, right? And sometimes when even these principles are in tension with themselves, like impartiality and independence, for example. So this session is designed to be a brave space. We use that word a lot over here. Not only a safe space, but especially a brave space for us to explore this delicate dance that humanitarian negotiators need to master in order to alleviate the suffering of the people who are impacted by crises. So the session will be split into two parts. In the first part of the session, I will have the pleasure to welcome with us. We will hear powerful stories from frontline practitioners, seasoned practitioners, who will share with you negotiation dilemmas that they had to face head-on. So they will invite you, and you will see through an interactive exercise, they will invite you to participate in their decision-making process. And we're gonna find out more about that. Afterwards, everybody will come on stage, and we will hopefully enjoy a nice and candid panel discussion to reflect on these experiences that they shared with us. So the goal of the session is not necessarily to provide easy answers or a one-size-fits-all approach to navigating dilemmas in humanitarian negotiations, but to spark an honest and vulnerable conversation about the complexities of humanitarian negotiations and the compromises we need to make, about the difficult choices that humanitarian frontline negotiators like yourselves have to make on a daily basis. What are the ethical considerations that we take? And hopefully, some ways, their organizations and our sector as a whole can support them. So we are fortunate and privileged to have with us a distinguished panel of frontline negotiators. With us, we have Caroline Gaudron from MSF Belgium. We have Asem El-Essawi from the ICRC, Jordi Casafontorra from UN OCHA, and last but not the least, we have Dr. Ed Schenkenberg van Mierop from here, Geneva. And I am certain that their unique perspectives and insights will hopefully enrich the discussions and challenge our thinking about humanitarian negotiations. And last but not least, to close the session, and as you saw this morning, we will hear also from Dr. Hugo Slim, who will be our key listener and will come with some ideas and final thoughts and reflections to take home before we conclude this very interesting day that we had together. So I encourage you to listen actively, because there will be storytelling as well, to engage thoughtfully, and especially not to hesitate to share your insights and your questions whenever the time will be given for that. And now I would like to ask and welcome on the stage Ms. Caroline Gaudron from MSF Belgium. So Caroline has more than 15 years of experience in the humanitarian sector with different INGOs and primarily with Médecins Sans Frontières. Caroline has worked also in many contexts, like the DRC, Sudan, the Ivory Coast, Central African Republic, Mozambique, and the list goes on if I continue, and has occupied positions in project coordination and most recently also as head of mission. Today, Caroline is a conflict and humanitarianism advisor at the MSF, and we will now leave the floor to you, Caroline, to share with us also the dilemma that you faced.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I will relate you a story that happened when I was head of mission with MSF. Our team was working, I won't tell you the country, and I will let you guess. Our team was working in a conflict area where a non-state armed group and the national army were fighting for several years. The conflict was fueled by ethnical tensions, socioeconomic grievance, religious radicalization, corruption, and resource discovery. We were struggling to negotiate access with the government to some parts of the region where we were. And we just got the authorization from the government to make an exploratory mission, a needs assessment. We had recently opened a communication channel with this non-state armed group, and the negotiation was going on well, but we had no security guarantee to move through the region yet. The non-state armed group was not really controlling any territory, so we were operating in gray zone. Otherwise, it would have been maybe easier. Few days after the Explo mission, guess what? The same place was attacked by the non-state armed group, causing numerous casualties. The group had entered the town from all the roads and from the sea. Medical staff were also victims. MOH staff were victims of the attack or had fled the place, leaving the population, of course, without any access to care. And there were no other medical organization. So the first decision we needed to take was, do we go or not? What do you think? I give the answer already, or I wait for the result? Gray zone, no real security guarantee, but no medical actor in the region. What do we do? What would you do? Of course, if we are here, is that there's no obvious answer. How long will it take? 9 seconds. Suspense. So indeed, we decided to go. We decided to go because we had the report of many wounded people without access to care, and of course the entire population was left without access to care. But the second decision then we needed to take was, okay, how do we get to this area? So allow me to add some details. So our team was at 4.5 4 hours from the site where the attack happened. The road, as I said, was very dangerous, and there were many ambushes all along the road and in the small villages around. The sea, it was possible to rent a boat and to access by sea, but it was quite dangerous also because, as I told you, the group also accessed the town by sea. There was no UN flight whatsoever, no private helicopter anymore. It was during COVID also. There was one plane operated by a private security company contracted by an extractive company. And this plane was landing inside the compound of this extractive company. You see me coming, huh? Okay, so what did we do? What would you do? Going by road, going by sea, not going at all. No, we said we go. Or going with this plane. So, of course, it was an impossible choice between ensuring the team safety, going there, but using a plane belonging to an extractive company and compromising our independence, which we hate. So yes, using MSF fleet by road and by... So guess what? We decided to use the plane. So why? Because it was really too dangerous. It was exposing the team to take the road or to take the sea. We were risking an attack while we had not enough security guarantee from the non-state armed group. But what we decided to do is to mitigate the risk by negotiating several things with several actors. So we have discussed with the government and we went there only with their green light. We have negotiated, we have informed the non-state armed group that we were going, and we have explained well why, that we were not working for the government, we were not linked to this extractive company, we were still very independent, but we had no choice but using this plane to go and take in charge the wounded people. And of course, we have discussed with the extractive company negotiating access to their airstrip, but negotiating no media and the way we would refer wounded serious cases. And we have discussed also with the private security company to make sure they will not wear any weapon in the flight that we will take. And just as a conclusion, it went well. We took in charge many wounded people. We stayed only a few days to mitigate also the risk of perception. And it didn't harm our perception, and we got access after that for a long-term access to this place where we still have operation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for sharing this very interesting story, also for the insights as well on the survey. So last but not least, please join me in welcoming Mr. Asim El-Issawi from the ICRC. So Asim is currently the operations coordinator for the ICRC in the Near East and Middle East region. And he joined the ICRC in 2009, apologies, after a career as an emergency or as a doctor as well, and has since assumed different roles, including in protection as well as in management functions. And just on the side, Asim was my manager when I was working as a field team leader in Iraq with the ICRC. So Asim, welcome, and we look forward to hear your story.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to work with you again, Hala. So thank you everyone for being here. I think I'll jump straight to the chase. My story is a bit different because it focuses on the interaction with individuals when it comes to negotiations. So I'm not going to share much info on the context itself, rather just the needed facts to try to help you to pick a choice or make a decision. So very briefly, we're talking about an area, as always, government-controlled part, opposition-controlled part. And we have one village at the edge of the government-controlled area. And the inhabitants of this village are of the same ethnicity as the opposition-controlled part, right? And we happen to have an office there, so it's just on the edge, on the front line. And we are based in that village that is under the government control, but with the inhabitants being of the same ethnicity as the opposition. We've always wanted to go and work in the opposition area, but so far we were not successful. And we had two main stakeholders to talk to: the chief of the village from the same ethnicity as the opposition, and the military commander in control of this particular region. So we were doing our best. We were still delivering and working in assistance for the people or the population of this village. And one day the military commander come and say, look, all assistance will have to come through us. We're the government. We need to be in charge of this. We need to know where goes what. The chief of the village said, if this happens, forget going and working in the opposition areas. You're never going to go anywhere. That's it. You lose all access. If you do it with me and you stick with me, We'll get you there with the approval of the central government. This military commander is not capable of anything. I'm more capable than him. So question number one, can we already, I don't know if this is gonna turn. So the first question, you have to make a choice. Agree to the military commander's terms and just tell him exactly what happens all the time, where the assistant comes and goes, or trust the chief in the village who says, I got it, I'm more influential than him. So the choices are to engage with the military commander, obey, ignore the military commander, and just go straight to the chief, or do nothing at all and wait until they both reach an agreement. It is, of course, difficult just to pick one without knowing more about the individuals. So in reality, a lot of homework and studying who was being done to pick one. But I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to give you more facts. I'm just let you choose, and then in the plenary, I think we can discuss a bit more. Excellent. So yeah. So indeed, the easy choice would seem to be to just, work with the government, get things done. It's quite the unintuitive way to trust the one who actually seems weaker, while in reality, he was the more capable person. So anyway, we do that. And then in the wake of things, this basically happened at a time when there was a mega attack on the opposition area with a lot of casualties, and we needed to go there to do emergencies. And then the village chief, because we trusted him, he facilitated that we go and deliver a first-time emergency intervention that was successful. After the first visit, we recognized that the humanitarian needs were immense, and we cannot not be working in that area for more than one reason. One, we are present there. This is, let's say, the bigger part of the geography is this opposition controlled. What does it look in front of donors if ICRC has an office in that place, but doesn't really work in half the territory per se or more? So we started saying, okay, now we want sustainable, regular, long-term access to do longer-term projects and interventions. Then the village chief popped up again and he said, now I can flex my muscles. For you to do that, I need 2 generators and fuel supply for 6 months. And the question was, it's not that we're against providing generator, but it has to be to some beneficiaries that would sort of correspond to our vulnerability criteria. Discussions back and forth. He said, look, I promise you, it's the one-off, it's the 6 month, and that's it. But for that, you're going to get unhindered access with the approval of the central government. What do I do? The second question. Do we say, we'll wait for the choices to come up. So basically, do we say, great, here's your 2 generators and your 6 month fuel supply? Or say, absolutely not, this is not going to work? Or keep negotiating until he's convinced of my position that we come on, do it more my way. I think the third choice is a bit more elusive, but yeah, the first 2 are more like it. So again, there was a negotiation here, and we had to make it work for both of us. Well, I kind of gave away the answer. Sorry for that. So well, let's find out. Let's find out. Well, yes, it is. Because here what we meant by the third choice was keep negotiating until we find something that corresponds more with let's say, ICRC's principles and vulnerability criteria, et cetera. And the response positively meant in reality that we tweaked what that could look like to make it more compliant as much as possible. But again, we will stop here, and what I will try to focus on more in the plenary is the main points here that I wrote in. First was how do you read an individual? How do you decide to trust which individual? Number 2, the internal negotiation, because the negotiation is just not external. I had to convince everybody on the inside that this is the decision. My hierarchy, my colleagues, even people who reported to me, they had to trust that I'm doing the right thing. And then, yeah, you have to decide what you lose for what you gain. And lastly, maintaining leverage. How did I manage to make sure that if I agree to certain terms, I'm sure I'm going to get what I'm promised. Voila, I'll stop here. Thank you, Hala. Thank you, everyone. Hope that was entertaining for you. And I guess you have your mics.
Thank you so much, Hassan. I think you can stay on the stage and pick a chair which you like. So maybe let's test. Okay, they are still working. So maybe first, join me in thanking warmly Jordi, Caroline, and Hassan for sharing their stories. In all honesty and transparency. And with us on stage, we are also welcoming Ed Schenkenberg van Mierop, who's the co-founder and executive director of here in Geneva, an independent think tank that works to close the gap between policy and humanitarian action. So Ed brings around more than 3 decades of humanitarian experience, humanitarian affairs in the field and at the global level. He's worked in many organizations, of whom I mentioned some, DARA in Madrid, MSF, and ICVA. And here, Geneva conducts fascinating research, at least a domain which I enjoy a lot, on reviewing and evaluating the humanitarian response. So I encourage you to check their website for the publications. But we're lucky to have Ed with us as well here, who will share also some of the insights around the topic that we are having. So voila, we are settling in the panel. So the panel, we have roughly maybe 30 or 45 minutes. And the idea of this panel, this discussion, all of us together, is really like in the CCHN's mandate and the mission. One of our aims is to always create these safe spaces for dialogue, for honest dialogue, where people can feel comfortable sharing, how are they navigating dilemmas, the difficulties that they're sharing, etc. So here we're simulating a little bit this dialogue over here to go back to some of these stories that Jordi, Caroline, and Asim have shared with us, and to try to explore a little bit, unpack how they navigated these dilemmas, what support systems did they have, what are some of the ways forward that they think are necessary in order to navigate all of these, okay? So we will have a little conversation. At some point, I will stop to give you the floor as well. We'll prompt a little bit to give you the floor in case you have any questions for the panel as well. So first, my first question also for you is, when you were here on stage, it seemed so easy, the decisions, they were telling us the story, and then at some point, you have the multiple choice, and then we chose, and it seemed so easy. But I'm guessing, and also from what humanitarian negotiators tell us at the CCHN, that these can be very lonely moments, these can be very embarrassing moments. I heard that word today. So how challenging was it for you to make these decisions at the time as well? And maybe I can start with you, Caroline.
So as you can imagine, obviously it was not an easy decision. What I felt as head of mission is that the risk was to clearly cross a red line, that this situation was challenging the humanitarian principles, and that I would not take any decision alone. So what we have done is that we have discussed among the team and obviously with our HQ, and we have debated because there were no straight answer. So we have analyzed the pros and cons. We went through a risk analysis between humanitarian imperative and team safety and principles, what to do. So we have debated, and we finally took this decision.
Thank you, Caroline. And I think at some point we will dig a little bit maybe deeper on like, okay, when we debate, what do we put in the equation as well? And maybe I'd like to give the floor also to Asim to react as well to this question. So maybe for OCHA, we are talking more about like the collective, etc. ICRC is one of like a big actor which also stands alone in the humanitarian community as well. So what was the most challenging part maybe in the decisions or in this dilemma that you had to navigate?
I mean, surprisingly, the most challenging part was our own internal alignment. Because in reality, when I went there, I was very clear. I'm not a magician, basically. A sort of, you want to access, there's a way to do it. You don't want access, say it. But then basically adapt your ambitions as an institution to what's realistic. At one point, I remember that I was asked to say yes to everyone, sort of obey the commander, give him what he wants, but at the same time, I have to make sure that the village chief also gave me what I wanted. And this is where I stood my grounds and I said, ask me to do one or the other. I cannot do both. Pick one. My choice is this, but I will follow eventually the orders of my hierarchy. So I guess it was there, and then to sell a trustable opinion, and then once you're trusted, the risk of this not working is all on your shoulder. So I guess this was the hardest part. Just it's my reputation on the line, but I believed I was doing the right thing, but also I needed to make sure that institutionally I was supported enough. So I guess that was harder than negotiating externally, actually.
Thank you for sharing this insight, Asim. I'd like to maybe like reflecting on the results that we saw in Mentimeter and the audience's response or the choices. We saw that we had like different ways, and that's what we said, right? Like there's no one size fits all or like one approach to navigating these situations. Ed, how about you? Like at here Geneva, you have been researching and evaluating principled humanitarian action, and you've produced fascinating reports on responses in Yemen, in Iraq, as well as in Ethiopia more recently. So you have been in contact also with these dilemmas and these challenges that humanitarian actors, negotiators are facing. So what's your understanding of the landscape today of navigating dilemmas in humanitarian negotiations? And is it even possible anymore to have principled humanitarian negotiations?
A couple of points. Thanks, Hala, for that question, because it's a good one. I'm realizing we're in the room with Hugo Slim, by the way, who started writing about humanitarian dilemmas in 1997. 27 years ago. So by no means is it a new topic, but somehow there's renewed attention to it. I'm sure some of you are familiar with ICFA, which has a group on humanitarian principles or principled humanitarian action at the moment. The other day, I was with a major European humanitarian donor in Nairobi, which for its planning next year started to discuss how should we promote principled humanitarian action. So, you know, at least there's discussion, and that's good, I would say, because it's exactly, and I think it's exactly what Jordi, Asim, and Caroline pointed out. You need dialogue on this. You need to reflect on this within your organization, and I would also say in a joint fashion. So the first thing there, as a researcher, precisely looking at the context that you mentioned, the first sort of question then that comes to us actually, so what is the state of dialogue taking place here on humanitarian principles? Because saying that you're humanitarian and saying that you are using principles in your negotiations or, you know, in deciding on dilemmas, well, how do I know? Saying that you're doing it is not enough. I would like, as an evaluator, I'd like to see evidence of that. Evidence perhaps in terms of training that has been done internally, evidence in terms of, you know, in an internal meeting, a dialogue, particularly also what Caroline referred to in terms of, you know, the discussion that took place within her team. Well, evidence in terms of the humanitarian country team discussion. Very glad to hear about the progress in Ethiopia now on red lines, because indeed when some of you may be familiar with that evaluation came out recently, when we looked at the quality of the dialogue, well, there was little dialogue in humanitarian principles, especially, and at the time, perhaps even when it was needed most, when the war broke out in Tigray in 2020, it was certainly on the mind of a number of people as such, but somehow not the discussion of the humanitarian country team. And that is kind of strange because it's precisely at the moment when it's needed most. How do we position ourselves vis-a-vis the government, for instance, or vis-a-vis the warring parties to the conflict in general, that actually there was no dialogue on it. Or, strangely enough, it's left to some subgroup. And Jordi, I really don't want to sort of belittle the work you've been doing in the Access Working Group, on the contrary. But clearly, and that's another element that comes up in much of our research, the important, I mean, it goes without saying, principles where we come from are central to the work we do. And somehow in the discussions, they seem to be an add-on, a luxury. Like, oh yeah, we also need to think about principles, because apparently there's kind of an assumption, we're all delivering principled humanitarian action. Well, as, you know, exactly as I said, what does that mean? So the collective discussion is really important. The thinking on that, and then that is what we don't see enough yet. Maybe it's increasing, as I said. But my last point on this, and this is also what we have seen, we saw it particularly in Yemen a couple of years ago, and we hope that it has improved. But again, of course, it's a challenging context. But there is a certain reluctance among agencies to discuss their dilemmas together. And we feel that there is a certain embarrassment which is at the root of this, that, you know, in terms of the compromises, the concessions, if you like, that are accepted, you know, agencies have a certain fear or somehow are afraid of disclosing that. And as a result of that, they sort of point to others. Well, they did this or they did that, instead of, you know, actually discussing this together. So it's actually what we call the prisoner's dilemma. You know, it's in the benefit of all to discuss it, but instead actually we're pointing fingers, and then you're worse off, so to speak. So these are at least some of the issues that we have found in our research, and yeah, you know, we're in that sense really trying to promote much more dialogue on humanitarian principles than we see now. Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. Anybody would like to react or add something on Ed's?
Yeah, but yeah, just a small actually follow on from my side. It's exactly this. I mean, when he said principles become a luxury, I see this quite often when people come and, like, we all would love to uphold the best principles we can, but when you are in a war zone where the last thing anyone looks for is respecting the law or the rules, and you come and you say, this is what the rules say, sometimes they don't even take you seriously, if you know. So you have to be pragmatic to a good extent, and with that you try to explain what the principles are for, and then if you help me apply more principles, I'll be able to get more assistance. And this is basically what we did, and said, if we can guarantee that the power from these generators will help a hospital and a school and this and that we can justify, then maybe I can get it for you. And then I will justify that because also I'll reach more people who need, etc., etc. So it's not 100% either principled or not, and I cannot say if you get 80% principles, it's fine. It's just what makes sense eventually. So,
two elements to add to this. One, document your decisions. Document your conversations as such. It is exactly points to the evidence of being a principled actor that I was mentioning. But it's also, in a way, particularly if you're in a position where you have to lead a decision-making process around certain dilemmas, in a way to protect yourself. What I would like to see is, I mean, I don't want to point fingers necessarily saying, you know, this was wrong and this was good, but what I would like to see is at least that the principles were taken into account, and that is exactly what is in the documentation. But as I said, it's also protect yourself in the sense of what you in that leader position, what you do is take into account all the factors that you know at that moment. And precisely what is so important, particularly when you think around to what degree are the compromises that we have to accept because we have to be there, are they still acceptable? You know, it shows what knowledge you had, but it's not just, of course, that question is not only important in the short term, it's also important in the long term. Many of you reacted on, we need to respect or need to honor and implement the humanitarian imperative. Now, of course, few would disagree with that, but sometimes being there, but being there then to a level that you're so instrumentalized that you're basically a subcontractor in the hands of one of the warring parties. I mean, maybe actually then there is a moment to say, we don't accept it any longer. Indeed, it's when the moment you would draw red lines, so to speak. Now, don't get me wrong, red lines are not the magic bullet, are not, you know, the magic formula as such, but at least they help you to think through those compromises, if you see what I mean. And having it on paper helps you to say, to show in your organization, this is what we took into account when we took the decision. Maybe now, looking back, months later or even longer, you know, we would have taken another decision, but that's with the knowledge now, so to speak. But that is exactly the element I would say one needs to document.
Thank you all. There are two words which came up a lot in the conversation now. We mentioned compromise and we mentioned red lines as well. And these are familiar words for those who are community members at the CCHN, because in this common methodology that we try to bring to the humanitarian sector and to frontline negotiators, one of these like common methodology terms is compromise. I don't know, if you look at your tote bag, you have the quote from Maulana Jalaluddin al-Rumi, says, out beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field and I will meet you there. And that captures exactly the essence of compromise, because we have to meet each other halfway. We have to walk towards the counterpart as well. And this notion of red lines, which is supposed to be like something which protects the negotiator who's really at the front line conducting these negotiations, so that they know like what is their playground, what is the box, the sandbox in which I'm supposed to operate and how not to cross them. So I'd like to maybe explore this a little bit. So to try to understand, like, how did you come about these decisions and the compromise that you made? And maybe my first question, I will address it to Caroline. I think one of the striking things about the story, and when we spoke about it the first time, was I asked you, so did you have any red lines when you were negotiating? Because clearly the situation was very exotic, to say maybe the least. So how did you get to decide what was an acceptable compromise and what was an unacceptable compromise? And I remember you had like many red lines, because MSF uses this language as well. So how did you put like a hierarchy maybe between those red lines?
You know, the MSF is not questioning the humanitarian principles, not at all. And MSF still has the same red lines. And you have the top, which are you do not harm when you intervene, and the team safety, of course. But of course, the humanitarian imperative. So how do you navigate between red lines with all these imperatives? There's no, again, straight answer. And you have to debate, you have to discuss, because you are also in more and more complex context where you have to negotiate. I'm not telling you something new, but when you have to negotiate with a government that is not very welcoming and not providing all the means or the access for you to operate and save life, when you have to negotiate in a conflict area with the non-state armed group, but you have counterterrorism laws in the country, and you are not supposed to speak with the group. You will piss the government off. When you have to face bureaucratic and administrative impediments, etc., etc. So negotiation is more and more complex. You have to make with the reality you face, and again, you have to discuss put some priority, the red line you will not cross, team safety, for example, and then take the least bad decision.
So I'd like to dig a bit deeper into that. So there were several red lines, right? There's the humanitarian imperative, we need to save lives. There was team safety. There were other things also, the relationship with the government, the trust that we have, the perception of the communities when they see us arriving in the... sorry to follow up on this, Caroline. Like you mentioned debate, like concretely, how does it happen? Like... the kind of back and forth, what are you considering? How do you make, like, how do you resolve this equation? If you can tell me more about that.
So for those who know MSF, it was not very formal. We haven't documented very well the decision process. So it's back and forth, yes, discussion locally with the team and with the leadership in Europe. And we were clearly, so the way I documented it somehow is that I was writing down the pros, the cons, the red line, etc. And then finally you find the only acceptable solution, which is you have to go, but with the team safety.
With the least bad choice, and maybe looking backwards and seeing that, okay, learning from this experience as well. Maybe, Asim, I remember when we were talking about this, the story or the situation that you face, you mentioned a lot like the role of culture, the local context, the presence on the ground. You had to navigate like maybe the dilemmas between favoring like one interlocutor over the other versus the access, the real impartiality, because the ones that were really more in need were on the other side of the border. But you also mentioned like one of the biggest negotiation that you had to do was internally. So how did you bring these together? Or how did you navigate this situation? How did you reach this compromise in the end?
Okay, I'll try to be elaborate and brief at the same time. I'm not sure how. But I mean, to jump into that, just I want to have a little comment as a prelude on compromise, because back to the earlier discussion, the previous panel, when they talked about local actors, when we're talking to these, they are local actors. I mean, government, tribal chiefs, etc. They are local actors. When we come and we discuss where the needs are, we as internationals tend to have sometimes very strict, square sort of criteria, and they think maybe no, the assistance is better off here. And then when we stick to what we think is right, and they don't know why, this is the problem. But if we sometimes try to listen to them more, and what I was trying to say here is that we could become, as I don't know, the previous panel said, less neutral than the local actor. You know, sometimes we fall in that pit. So on the one hand here, to go back to what you were asking, Hala, is the culture. So you have to understand what it means for why did I trust the tribal chief, for example. I would know because in that context, this is how he thinks. For him to be able to support and be influential, he needs to tick a few boxes also on his side. So when you ask something from somebody, you have to ask what's feasible for them. You know, I mean, no one is a magician, not an actor, not an international organization. So be logical. So knowing very well the culture, knowing how to talk to him and project also a position of power from my side. I understand in a specific culture what ticks, what makes him think this person is credible and what doesn't. So I really had to make sure he saw that. For example. So, and that went with a lot of analysis, and you'll not believe me talking about documentation. We wrote pages and pages on analyzing the personality of this person and why we think he might be able to say what he can do. So again, it goes back to we had to document every single step to make sure that at the end of the day, it's a collective decision, but there was a lot of reading between the lines. It was not that straightforward. It's okay, what do you mean by people in need? Because when we say the most vulnerable, the less vulnerable is not, I mean, they're not roaming around in luxury cars. You know, the less vulnerable could also need a bag of rice. So voila, I guess you have to balance all those elements together. Hope that answered the question well.
Yeah. Thank you, Asim. And I have a question also for Caroline. So Caroline, in the framework of your functions today at MSF, you also contribute to strengthening the capacity of the teams on negotiation as well, and you're also exposed like to a diversity of teams and of actors. So I'll ask the question for Caroline, but also feel free to add if you have anything about that. What role? So Asim, you spoke about like knowing or mastering the local culture, etc. And this goes back to the sources of legitimacy that the CCHN refers to when we talk about like who do you choose as your negotiator to lead on that. But maybe my question for you, Caroline, is what role do you think that like experience, intuition play in helping us like navigating this art of compromise?
So we have learned from the past, from our mistakes, and as I said, we are navigating in more and more complex contexts. So we acknowledge the need to have professional negotiators or to have trained coordinators, people. And so we have now more and more training for everybody. And what we say in those trainings is that first of all, of course, being aware of the environment, having an accurate actors mapping, understanding the culture, having people speaking the language, etc., is absolutely very important, and we can't improvise. So intuition maybe, but improvisation not at all. People have to be very well prepared to have more chance in their negotiation.
Anybody would like to add on that?
Yeah, certainly. Couple of thoughts here in terms of, so obviously what these stories are showing, it's not reinventing the wheel each time, but you have to go with your team, you need to have that dialogue each time. But what is so important there is also institutional knowledge. I mean, we see places, countries, where because of indeed, particularly on the international side, of course, there's this heavy rotation. The authorities know the agencies better than the agencies know themselves in terms of, what decisions, what compromises were made in the past. That's problematic. So you really, and again, come back on that need for documentation, build that institutional knowledge. I think that is really important. I'm putting plugs. I already mentioned Hugo started writing Doing the Right Thing back in 1997, particularly also your book in 2015, I believe, on humanitarian ethics. So all the writings there, and there's a lot of writing on humanitarian principles. Obviously, our own studies have been mentioned recently, and I promised Manisha that I put a plug in for her. Humanitarian Outcomes research group as well, very recently, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, published a guidebook. It's called No Easy Choice, a humanitarian's guide to ethical principled decision-making. For those of you who are writing, humanitarianoutcomes.org is the URL, the website where you find it. It helps you. There's no cookie cutter sort of recipe or way of doing this, as I said, but it helps you in terms of decision making. Who is involved from your team? Did you engage with the affected community in a way on your dilemma? Did you involve them in it? As I already mentioned, what's the institutional knowledge on it? Are you engaging other organizations on it? Sort of the steps by steps that you need to go through in terms of your decision making. I think that really helps you to frame that.
Thank you, Ed. And I've had a look at this guidance, and it's true. It's very insightful into maybe having not a step-by-step approach, but let's say a structured approach to navigating a little bit these options. Because humanitarian action or humanitarian negotiation, is not straightforward. It's very complex. We talk about complex systems where there are tensions between factors, where there are competing demands, where there are these dilemmas as we talk about them. But there are in the theories that exist out there, there are some frameworks like polarity management, etc., which help us have a more maybe systematic approach at identifying these tensions, identifying the short-term and the long-term consequences of that, and maybe trying to make the least bad choice. And I think this is the most important part of it as well. I'm a bit curious to also have you react a little bit before, and in the meantime, I'll switch to this slide. So if you have any questions, please note them down here as we are heading into the last 10 minutes maybe of our panel. But I'd like to make you reflect a little bit, dear panelists, a little bit on what is the kind of support that you received when you were facing these decisions, or in general, not necessarily the situation, but in general, as humanitarian negotiators, what kind of support exists within your organizations, outside of your organization. I will give the mic to Caroline. I think you'd like to react, what kind of support did you, as Caroline, frontline negotiator, receive when you were facing not only the situation you explained to us, which we're not going to tell you which country it was, but overall in general, when you are facing these difficult choices?
Of course, when you have to take such tough decision, it's always in bad conditions. So I mean, you have to take, you have few hours in front of you because people are dying. If you don't intervene within 24 hours, you will lose people. So you don't have time. You don't have guidelines and policies that will apply to all contexts. Of course, so you have to make your own risk analysis, taking into account the reality of this context. But having said that, what really helps is experience sharing. Because you might have a colleague, very experienced colleague, who has faced this type of situation and will give you some advice. So experience sharing is the most important, and of course we are also collaborating a lot with CCHN. One more time, training, and during those training we have experience sharing. We debate already about all these questions, and people are better prepared, so probably will take better decision.
Thank you, Caroline. And definitely, like we say, prepare, prepare, prepare. And we give this common methodology. And maybe one of our aims is that we try to also give a common language so that organizations, as individual organizations or as a collective, share this common methodology and the same language, and knows maybe how to approach these negotiations in a structured way. I think we'll take one question. We have 9, and unfortunately I cannot see all of them. I didn't put the floating mode, but let's take this one, and it's a bit related to this feeling of maybe being confident and having a bit of trust, not feeling embarrassed in sharing this experience and these difficult things you're going through sometimes when you're facing these choices. So maybe it's a bit related to that. How would you deal with the situation if the outcomes ended up to be bad? And this can happen, right? Because as you said, sometimes you have 24 hours to decide. And I remember a quote that you told me, Asim, at some point you need to decide something, you have to make a decision, but then maybe sometimes the outcomes will be bad. So anybody would like to answer this question?
Well, to answer that question is from the beginning, how do you plan to deal with the possibility of bad outcomes? Because it's not, it is one of the possible options. one good thing to do is to try to sort of compartmentalize your losses and stretch the timeline upon which this could happen. For example, if we take an example, somebody that said supply of whatever, gas, this over 6 months. Well, I will give a certain quantity periodically and make sure what I give, I see the required progress. So I still have the leverage to stop at any time when I see that this is not going in the right direction. So this one, to maintain leverage for the longest possible period until you reach a stage when you're anchored. To try to elaborate further more on that. So basically, maintaining a supply of something for 6 months, given that, for example, we gained access to that other side with the beginning of 6 months. After 6 months of regular access to the opposition side or to the other side, and then it becomes more and more difficult to stop it, given that, for example, the person we're talking about is from the same ethnicity, so he would be held accountable if ICRC, for example, or any other actor does not reach them anymore. So here, what meant I gave myself a 6-month period to make sure that whatever we attempted is consolidated and anchored, and at the same time, I still have leverage, because as long as this is going well, there's an ongoing benefit for everyone until we reach anchoring stage and we say deal is off. If, for whatever reason, the other side says, well, no, I lied, that was not the deal, you still have to do more, it will be more difficult for them to say that. So this is one way to avoid. The second thing, if the bad outcome happens, your best ally is, as they said, documentation. It's a collective decision. It's not just one person's decision. It's an institutional decision. And the bad outcome should be factored in from the start.
Thank you, Asim. So maybe we are ready to maybe start wrapping up a little bit the discussion, but I'd like to give you the floor maybe just briefly to share with us, like we have many frontline negotiators here in the room. We have like a collective number of experience in this auditorium. What is maybe the one lesson that you would like to share with the audience today? Maybe starting with you, Caroline, and then we move transition towards Ed.
So I would recommend to stick to the humanitarian principles, but then you have the theory and the reality. So never stop brainstorming, discussing, debating to try reaching the least bad solution, option.
No, I mean, I think the lesson learned here is the support I got from my colleagues, and here by my colleagues, I'm talking more about the ones who reported to me, because without them, this would have never happened, because everyone was deployed to manage a part of the negotiation with their level, corresponding level in all sides, and it was very important, this support. So I guess if your team trusts you, that's things will work. And then if you fail, they will also stand and defend that failure.
Thank you. And Ed, what about you? What does the research tell us also on some recommendations?
Certainly one point, just to emphasize, building on the emphasis or the importance that has been given to making sure that it's a shared decision, not one person, but one that has been discussed within a team and so on. What particularly important there is also engage the leadership of the organization on these issues. They're not nice to haves or add-ons. They should be central to the organization. And what we particularly see there, certainly on the NGO side, is really a shameful lack of understanding of humanitarian principles, particularly among boards. What they judge the chief executive on is financial health, program volume, those kind of metrics. Hardly any time in terms of, what have you done with regards to certain dilemmas that your organization faced. And it actually starts with educating boards. Boards have a responsibility when it comes to the reputation, the credibility of an organization. And it's amazing how little boards know about humanitarian ethics and humanitarian principles. So really engage your boards, your leadership and your boards on these issues. They're governance issues as well. Thanks.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Ed. Humanitarian principles remain our compass, hopefully, And I'd like to invite Mr. Hugo Slim to the lectern just to share with us as key listener. You've been listening like this morning. So what are some of the insights you'd like to share with us?
Thank you very much, Hala, and thank you. That's another fascinating panel. And it's really a very reality-based panel. And it's one thing to write about humanitarian principles and ethics like I do, but it's, that's pretty easy. It's another thing to really do it like you people do. So I admire you. You have my admiration from the start in this panel. While we're talking of writing, Ed's mentioned a few things that are useful. Another classic paper on all this is actually by two people at ICRC, Pascal Daudin and Jeremy Labbé as well, which I think uses pragmatism and principles. And I know Pascal's here today, so yeah. So that's another good one to add to your list. So how should we start to, I'm just going to make some observations again about what I've sort of heard in this panel. The first thing is sort of around the discourse, the language we use or the panel used. And at one level, it's very binary. So it's saying, you know, you've got this column or that column, which are you going to choose? So it's very binary. But at the other level, you consistently use this very, actually non-binary word, which is navigate. So in a funny way, although you present these problems as very one or the other, you don't really believe that, because in fact, the language you use is the language of the sea, where you go with the waves, you navigate by the stars and other things. So you are using, your discourse is slightly at odds, which is interesting. One thing that comes out very clearly, I think, and I don't think it was a surprise to any of us when we saw the results, if we talk of an ethical preference or a moral tendency in these problems, I think we have to recognize that the moral tendency, the ethical preference of our community, the humanitarian community, is always to engage, to go, as Caroline was saying, and to compromise. And I think that basic ethical tendency is a good one. I think that's a, important moral instinct. And I think we should be, proud of it and own it, as we did in this panel, and people did. And it's lovely to hear Rumi. I think any panel which quotes something from Rumi has got to be onto a good thing. So it's lovely to hear a bit of Sufism in this very difficult area, which I think is probably an appropriate theology for it too. The other thing that you do, though, you say we're going to engage and we're going to go, but, and then you use this phrase, red lines, okay? So then you say, but we're going to do it with red lines. So you're always trying to stop yourself. Now, listening to you, of course, and bearing in mind your navigation, it's very clear when I hear you that, is it a useful phrase, red lines, when actually you usually cross them? So why would you use the phrase red line? Maybe amber light is better, because actually we do sometimes, we can stop or we can go. So maybe an amber light is probably more, realistic about what we do. But then maybe red is a good color, because if we don't say that that's an important thing, we might call it a red flag rather than a red line, because you might walk past a flag. We're trying to tell ourselves, avoid the slippery slope of always just degrading to go through the amber light, because that would be wrong. You're only meant to go to the amber light if, using your discretion, it's the best. So I think the word red line needs a bit more interrogation, and you use it, but don't really, because you're always breaking it. The third thing that was sort of buried, I think, in a lot of the discussion, we didn't actually hear the word, but it was consent. And in fact, there were sort of three types of consent I heard. There was a discussion, Geordie and presumably his nightmare in Ocha with, the UN teams, interagency consent. How do you get that? How much do you need? How is it important? And how does interagency consent weigh up against people's consent, the community's consent? Burst the red line, come, or don't. Whose consent is more morally weighty? and of course the consent of powerful politicians, which tends to dictate anyway. So consent is really at the heart of a lot of what you're thinking. I also heard sort of implicitly that, you know, the power of those politicians, the control over you in your decision-making very often. And that can be total control, you know, for which Ethiopia is famous. And, you know, it's an impressive empire of, you know, hundreds of years. So that is a culture of control, quite top-down control. And that's part of a possible context. The other type, though, is the grey zone type that Caroline was talking about more, Caroline was talking about more, where it's more fuzzy, and Assam as well. You know, there's a grey zone. It's not total control, it's much more ambivalent. So that context is always important. The other thing that came through very strongly, and we know this as well because that's how we define ourselves, is the pressure, the time-life pressure, as you might call it, the pressure of time to save human life. So the time-life pressure that weighs always on moral decision-making in these contexts. And then the other thing I think I heard a lot, because this is the navigation bit, is alternatives. So in fact, it's not as binary very often, and navigating means trying alternatives and looking at different angles and trying different routes, of course. And some of that means other humanitarian programs. You know, who else is doing other things that I don't actually need to really make a bad compromise here, if there are alternative services of some kind? And then, of course, there's what other non-humanitarian options are there, like the corporate helicopter or give the guy a generator. You know, so, you know, what are our options and our alternatives? And that's really important. Finally, though, I just want to think about a little deeper about what's underneath the discussions in this panel and sort of where I felt the iceberg was. First of all, there are different purposes in play. You know, a government has to govern. It has to govern across a whole range of objectives. Humanitarians just have one: human needs, suffering, etc. So there's really big differences of moral purpose at play. Unit of analysis as well. A lot of governments govern thinking much more about the collective, that group of people, that problem, that area, whereas humanitarians are obsessed with individual human rights. And those different units of analysis underlie a lot of these tensions. Then there is the challenge of deliberation, and I think, you know, Ed spoke very powerfully to this, but you all talked about debate, discussion. You didn't use the word deliberate, but in ethics you would say deliberation is key. And that must be deep as possible, you know, thinking together, thinking things through, but it must be as wide as possible too, thinking with people, thinking with the community, thinking those affected, etc. But I agree, there must be an evidence, a paper trail of this. You've got to prove you did it. You've got to show you did it. Or I'm going to tell you you didn't and you're negligent. So I think that's really important as well, and that was a strong point. One last thing I just want to say then to sum up. Sorry, I started late, obviously. The thing that's really striking is the moral courage of all of you. Okay? The fact that Geordie, Assam, and Caroline are ready to really see the moral risk, really take the moral risk and get their hands messy and dirty. And I would just say that you use the phrase a lot, least best option. I prefer Assam's phrase, it makes moral sense. That's a more positive way of saying, actually, it's the right thing to do, because although it's dreadful and it's difficult, it makes moral sense. So well done for making moral sense.
Thank you. Thank you so much.